Good afternoon. My name is Kim Baldwin. The paper I will be presenting to you today is entitled Counterfeit Decency: Charity as Exploitation in the Creation of Women's Reformatories. There is an underside to every age about which history does not often speak, because history is written from the records left by the privileged. This paper challenges the notion that reformatory institutions of the 19th century, particularly the Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls, represent success in prison reform, as is so often depicted in historical records. Michelle has told you about the physical abuses that took place at the institution. I focus attention both on economic abuses suffered by female prisoners and the exploitative labor model of the prison work programs. The events that produced the Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls were part of a larger class struggle playing out in the Gilded Age. From this perspective, the first superintendent, Sarah Smith, and prison reformer, Rhoda Kauffman, like other feminist reformers, used their social and political advantage to advance a moral agenda and profit from the incarceration of working-class females. Smith and Kauffman also supported special interest legislation that effectively prevented others from competing with them, hindering other reforms. While actively and aggressively working to reform certain classes of women, whom they deemed deviant, they resorted to questionable tactics and unethical behavior to ensure high rates of return on their investment in the institution and create a model for capitalizing on the prison's labor force. Michelle has already spoke of Sarah Smith and Rhoda Kauffman, the two most important women responsible for the institution's creation and its leadership over the first decade. Sarah Smith was born in England and orphaned at a young age. She became a Quaker sometime before her 18th birthday and was greatly influenced by Elizabeth Gurney Fry, a famous Quaker prison reformer. She married fellow Quaker James Smith, with whom she immigrated to the United States, settling in Indiana in 1840, where they became lifelong friends with Charles and Rhoda Kauffman. Rhoda was the daughter of a farmer in the Richmond area. Charles was the son of a state's leading Quaker and well-to-do banker. Beginning at a young age, Charles went to work for his father, eventually succeeding him as head of the Richmond National Bank and as the clerk of the Indiana Yearly Meeting, the highest distinction in the Society of Friends, a position he and his father would hold for more than half a century. The two couples quickly emerged as major social reformers in Indiana. After immersing herself in the temperance movement and then in the education of freed slaves, Sarah was instrumental in establishing and managing the Indianapolis Home for Friendless Women, and later became the first superintendent of the Indiana Reformatory for Women and Girls. Meanwhile, the Kauffmans were among the founders of another home for friendless women in Richmond. They shared the Smiths' interest in reformatories and were the masterminds behind House of Refuge for juvenile offenders in Plainfield, and later the Reformatory for Women and Girls. A genuine power couple of the Gilded Age, the Kauffmans were movers and shakers in Indiana, where they maintained a relatively lavish lifestyle, complete with a ballroom in their mansion. They were sought-after speakers, both nationally and internationally, on many topics, especially prisons. In the mid to late 19th century was a time of unprecedented accumulation of wealth for businessmen in the North. As Vernon J. Briggs, Jr., professor of labor economics at Cornell University, explains, as a result of government investments in wartime manufacturing, industrialists scrambled to use the newly available machine technologies to meet the massive demand for their output, and bankers acquired control over vast amounts of liquid wealth. This new class of nouveau riche amassed far more wealth than the older patrician aristocracy, who had accumulated their riches gradually, largely through commerce over the previous generations. Nor did this newly wealthy and politically dominant class have any tradition to guide itself in the use of its wealth. As a result, here in Indiana, a newly wealthy, politically dominant class sought to convert the poor and marginalized to a particular set of values through institutions of relief, like the Home for Friendless Women and the Indiana Reformatory for Boys, Women, and Girls, through founding and governing the literal civilizing institutions of the era. Upper middle class reformers, like the Smiths and Kauffmans, imposed their moral agendas, perpetuating a belief that certain classes of people could not be trusted to make decisions regarding their own values. The new power elites believed that the formerly powerful institutions of church and family could no longer adequately instill morality in society, and that the newly established outside institutions could, such as prisons, orphan asylums, poor farms, and reformatories. Institutions such as these were extremely large undertakings that required large investments. Although there was an entirely new class of investors, those willing to provide capital wanted stability. However, to achieve stability, other reform institutions that competed for government money and inmates had to be eliminated, thus creating a monopoly of financial and human capital. To address this issue, lawmakers gave charters to certain corporations, giving them the legal right to conduct business and raise money as long as they were not affiliated with a church. Subsequently, with articles of incorporation drawn, boards of affluent directors were fashioned. Take, for example, the Indianapolis Home for Friendless Women. The home's board of trustees read like a who's who of local well-to-do men, lawyers, bankers, doctors, and real estate moguls, all well connected politically and tied to local government. The board of managers, meanwhile, consisted of their socialite wives. The initial funding for the home came from the Young Men's Christian Association, through the auspices of none other than Charles Kauffman. A mere 9 rooms in the Second Ward on Pennsylvania Street. Judging the location unsuitable, the trustees furnished prime real estate on North Tennessee Street, just beyond the city limits. The city of Indianapolis and the county of Marion gave additional monies totaling some $15,000. The board signed the home's articles of incorporation, giving them the legal right to conduct business and raise money, in part by fines for breach of any ordinance of such city for the suspicion of vice and immorality. What was ostensibly a private philanthropy was now a monopoly, financed by taxpayers by fines levied primarily on the lower classes. And how were the board of managers spending the money? Apparently not on the home's inmates. Newspaper accounts of nothing to eat in the refuge were frequent. One inmate was quoted as saying, "Somebody should donate a barrel of crackers and some cabbage." When Sarah and James were supervising the home's Dickensian conditions, each received $300 per annum, plus an extra $50 as needed, while those in their charge went hungry. Private or semi-private institutions were not the only problem. Robert Robertson, professor of sociology at Indiana University, records that at the first time in Indiana, children were becoming less of an economic asset to their families and more of a liability because of a series of laws that restricted child labor in both age and hours worked. As a result, the state assumed more responsibility for dependent children. Previously, the only provisions made for such children were that they should be cared for in county poor farms and that they were allowed to be leased out. Then Charles and Rhoda Kauffman persuaded the Indiana legislature to pass an act creating the House of Refuge for the correction and reformation of male juvenile offenders and appropriating for this purpose the gigantic sum of $50,000. The act provided that, at the judge or jury's discretion, any child under the age of 18 who was likely to be confined in a state prison or county jail might be sent to the new house instead. In the process of filling that institution, far more boys were labeled incorrigible, vicious, destitute, and in danger of leading idle and immoral lives. Indiana still lacked an institution for delinquent girls. That same year the boys' reformatory opened, Sarah and Rhoda testified before the legislature, urging them to establish a combined, and thus less expensive, reformatory institution for women and girls. In 1873, the reformatory opened, with Sarah as superintendent, earning the handsome sum of $800 per annum, while James served as steward, earning half that amount. The inhabitants were girls who Sarah reports were taken out of jail as they might be more profitably employed clearing rubbish from the new building. The institution was composed of two branches, the reformatory for girls under 16 and the penal department for everyone else. Inmates of the reformatory were girls convicted of crimes such as larceny or incorrigible conduct, some of whom were orphans. For those who were not orphans, often the parents were persuaded by Smith that they were unable to care for their daughters and they should abandon them to the institution. The cost of running a reformatory was unavoidably high. To offset the cost, Indiana's former governor, Conrad Baker, who was also a member of the institution's Board of Visitors, wrote to the current governor, Thomas Hendricks, in 1874. As long as there are so few inmates in the institution, the expense of the institution must unavoidably be comparatively high. And it is to be hoped that the different counties will avail themselves of the advantages of the institution by committing to its guardianship some, at least, of the girls which are to be found in every community, who need and are entitled to such guardianship. It is believed that the people, as yet, do not generally understand that a girl need not be an offender against the penal laws of the state to justify her committal to the reformatory department of this institution. To increase the number of prisoners, the board also sought to change the law regarding the age of committal and duration of stay for the girls in the reformatory, and offer an economic incentive for counties to commit the children. As a result, the girls in the reformatory increased in population and from counties across Indiana. From the beginning, the goal of the managers was to have every girl in the reformatory profitably employed. An adage of prison government is that the best prisoners are self-supporting. In the annual report of the Board of Managers of the institution, we find the line, "Regular systematic labor we believe to be a very important auxiliary in any system of reformation for young girls." The principle was daily enforced, and all of the girls were taught to work in a style later termed rotation of the crops by a journalist in 1890. After half a day of school, as mandated by state law, a certain detail would wash half day, then iron clothes, then sew, then scrub, then cook, in addition to weaving cane-coated chair bottoms. Scripture was read aloud to the children when they worked. Smith quoted 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Our motto has been, "If you do not work, you shall not eat." As the population of the reformatory increased, a recommendation to amend the existing law came from the board, stating that it would be better if only girls between the ages of 12 and 16 be admitted to the reformatory, as the older girls could work harder. They wrote, "There are at present in the reformatory quite a number of small children. It surely cannot have been the intention of the legislature to make this a state orphan asylum. We recommend that such an appropriation be made for working capital, that certain special industrial pursuits may be carried on more economically and advantageously to the state." It is clear that the aim of the reformatory's management was to decrease the cost of maintaining the facility and to turn a profit by using the human capital of the displaced children. The principal work of the institution was washing. So as not to compete with the poor women of Indianapolis who were economically dependent on laundering work, a glove-making business was introduced. However, when these businesses did not turn a profit, the Board of Managers saw them as unsuccessful, exacerbating conflicts between the all-male board, and the female staff who controlled the institution. After a 3-year struggle for control, Rhoda Kauffman successfully deposed the old board, replacing it with an all-female board of which she was president. On the 3rd of March, 1877, by an act of state legislature, the Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls became the only internationally recorded prison under the entire management of women. These women quickly turned a profit. Local news sources reported that the current expenses per year had been $21,500 since the ladies had charge of the institution, while, in contrast, the expenses while the gentlemen had management were $28,000. To achieve these savings, they decreased the cost of housing their prisoners from $208 per annum per prisoner to $142, a 30% drop. Another part of their success came from adopting a new method of laundering at the penal department of the women's prison. In fact, the new method was so profitable that the entire reformatory adopted it, so that before a girl could be discharged from the reformatory, she had to be able to launder in the new style. The Ticket to Leave program was instituted at this time as well. This novel program provided underage girls as domestic servants to affluent homes in the neighboring community. This service was invaluable to Smith, giving her greater power over the girls. For if they failed to perform their duties, they were subject to recall, even for offenses as minor as being saucy or stealing a hair ribbon. Though the prison profiteering was going well, scandals plagued the benevolent institution. Now, Michelle has already told you about the 1881 investigation into brutality at the prison, but that was not the whole story. Journalist Gideon B. Thompson reported on a blackmailing scheme involving Sarah Smith, a girl from the reformatory, and a local politician. General A.D. Strait, a Civil War hero and candidate for the Republican nomination for governor the previous spring, was called to testify before the committee, composed of newly elected Republicans. To avoid a political scandal, the committee conducted most of the hearing behind closed doors, and then reported that Strait had nothing of any significance to say. What Thompson suggested in his articles, however, was that Sarah Smith had accused Strait of impregnating a young girl whom he admits stayed at his house for a short time, as part of a program in which the girls from the reformatory were leased out as domestic servants. Strait also accused Smith of blackmail. This was not the first blackmailing scheme Sarah was linked to. John Fishback, journalist for the Sentinel, alleged that the board of the Indianapolis Home for Friendless Women, on which Smith had served, was involved in convening at or countenancing crime, blackmail, conspiracy, criminal negligence, and neglect. Scandals surrounding Sarah Smith did not compare to those that soon engulfed the Kauffmans. Now, as you may recall, Charles, like his father before him, was president of the Richmond National Bank. Customers were primarily Quakers, small businessmen, and artisans, whose deposits, in turn, had financed not only Rhoda and Charles' social projects and lavish lifestyles, but also of their 4 sons. As president, Charles had made unsecured loans amounting to over half the bank's capitalization, either to his sons or to the companies that they controlled. In 1884, the bank collapsed. Headlines broadcast unsecured loans made to family members, mishandling of estates and trust funds, even suicide by distraught depositors, many of whom were from the poor, unfortunate class the Kauffmans helped to marginalize. The Kauffmans fled to Chicago to avoid arrest and were disowned by their Quaker monthly meeting. 2 of their sons later went to prison for other financial scandals, while a third, a disgraced stockbroker in New York, eventually committed suicide. All of these matters are noted by historians, yet almost always as a footnote to the Kauffmans' storied careers as social reformers. Yet, It is worth noting that the sum total of financial loss due to the misdeeds of the Kauffmans was exponentially greater than that of all the combined total of the economic crimes committed by those they imprisoned, which leads us to the unescapable conclusion that theft, when it is small and committed by marginalized people, is a crime. But when it is large and committed by elites, it is merely an unfortunate business practice. Or, as sociologist Kai Erikson elucidates in his study of 17th century Puritan life in Massachusetts, there is often a fine line between the behavior a society deems deviant and the behavior a society deems acceptable or even exemplary. Definitions of deviance vary widely as we range over the various classes found in a single society or across the various cultures. And it soon becomes apparent that there are no objective proprieties which all deviant acts can be said to share in common. Behavior which qualifies one woman for prison may qualify another for sainthood. This paper conducted a critical examination of Sarah Smith and Rhoda Kauffman, who founded and governed several of the literal civilizing institutions of the 19th century, with a view to reform as well as punish, that had more to do with the making of money and arbitrary morality than with the loving care of those in their charge. They aided in the creation of laws, customs, and class structures that denied countless numbers of women their fundamental rights by imposing their agendas, thus perpetuating a false belief that certain classes of people were unable to make decisions regarding their own basic moral standards, and creating a society where morality was systematically linked to an economic factor. Their institutions were underpinned by material supports, propagating economic and cultural injustices, linking and reinforcing each other. The result was, and still is, a vicious cycle of cultural and economic subordination and social injustice that has become the cultural norm. Thank you.